who's going to lend money to jurisdictions if a big rich place like Chicago or Illinois can't meet its obligations? And so these are really difficult choices. And so I have some ideas about things we could do to make the problem better, but it's worth thinking about what you would do. I mean, one of the things I found during the COVID period is there was a lot of intense arguing about what the federal government, should we have a state bankruptcy law? Should we offer all of this aid? Is it a blue state bailout? Is it a red state bailout? And I found that the people talking about this really didn't take the time to realize how hard a set of choices were facing the government. It was just a lot of yelling.
It is my pleasure to welcome to the podcast a very smart man, Yale Law School professor and author of In a Bad State, Responding to State and Local Budget Crises, David Schleicher. Welcome, David.
Thank you so much for having me.
So congrats on this book. Some people look at this and be like, what, state and local budget crises? Are those a thing? And there was a period when everyone thought they were going to be a big thing post-COVID, where COVID shut the economies down, and I was seeing the headlines being like, hey, if these local governments have to fire a bunch of people, you're going to have a lot more fired people. And then the feds came through in a very, very big way. The CARES Act, I think it's about $5 trillion of stimulus in total, hundreds of billions of which went to state and local governments. So all is okay, right?
Yeah, so the answer is in some ways, for a little while, the answer was yes. So state and local budgets have been in better shape for the last couple of years than they've been maybe in any point in American history, or at least certainly they've been as good, between the fact that the economy never really got as bad as people expected, and particularly high-end wealth, which is state local budgets that are dependent on high-end income taxes and capital gains taxes, did very well. And then the utter boatloads of money that the federal government gave, state and local budgets were in really strong shape. But right now, we're seeing an end to that federal money. That money is drying up. Some of it was even pulled back in the debt limit deal. And we're seeing revenues starting to fall. And so you're starting to see projected budget deficits in California and Illinois and New York and New York City. And what we're going to see is how many jurisdictions use the boom times to save and to fundamentally reform their budget so they'd be healthy going forward, and which ones kind of played Brewster's Millions with the money, just got it and spent it as quickly as they could.
Yeah, so just because you write up some examples, how many did this rainy day fund thing, and you have an example or two, and then how many were like, screw it, this money spigot will go forever, let's spend.
Well, so it's a little hard to say. A lot of jurisdictions saved money in the rainy day funds, but the real question is, did they create liabilities going forward that's going to be hard for them to reverse? And so you see places that when you hire a bunch of new workers, it's really hard to fire them the next year. Or if you cut taxes, people are going to be really unhappy about the taxes being cut going forward. And so the real problems are not merely the savings, but it's the creation of liabilities going forward. And so rainy day funds are pretty healthy at the moment on average across jurisdictions.
And yet, for whatever reason, it feels like there's another shoe to drop. Now, one of the major things that you see in headlines, and you and I are in New York, is that commercial real estate is not faring very well. Barbara Corcoran of Shark Tank, who's a real estate expert, said that Midtown commercial buildings are 50% occupied. And this is, at this point, like years after reopening. You might even say that most major companies have already come down with various policies. So it's not like 50% with a giant up arrow attached to it necessarily. I mean, it rebounded from near zero to 50%. But these buildings aren't viable at 50% occupancy.
No, I mean, commercial property values are falling and going to keep falling, at least for the short or medium term. And that has pretty big implications for local government budgets that govern downtowns for a couple of reasons. One is that commercial property tax rates are generally higher than residential property tax rates because offices don't vote, but people do. Um, and secondly, it's going to cause some disruptions, and it also will reduce. I mean, the working from home will reduce sales tax revenue because people aren't going to the office. Then they're not buying lunch or whatever. And maybe the type of governments that are most directly affected are not even the ones that are directly taxing commercial property taxes, but are transit agencies. Transit agencies have lost enormous amounts of revenue because people just aren't riding trains because they're not commuting quite as much, or the commuting rates have fallen. And while New York is bad, it's not the one that's worst off. San Francisco, the office utilization in San Francisco is really, 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 really low. And so some of this will shake out over time, which is as prices fall, you'll get new tenants in. Different types of tenants will emerge. Hopefully, although it doesn't, it's actually much harder than people think. You'll see some residential conversions, but it's going to create pretty big revenue losses in the short and medium term for cities, and maybe even longer than that.
Yeah, so let's press on the residential conversions. So it turns out it's very, very hard to turn an office building into an apartment building. And some of the practical problems are plumbing. So think about your average office building. It's got one restroom, two restrooms, three restrooms, and then when it's time to put in apartments, like everyone wants a restroom, so like that's a big problem. There are a lot of interior spaces that might not have windows, which is a no-no for a lot of apartments. Kitchens, the same jam.
The elevators are often not built to the same specifications that are required for residential building. You've got a lot of building code problems for residential conversions. It's just not happening. I mean, and then on top of it, you'd need a lot of zoning changes, and in New York you'd need some state law changes. Residential office conversion is really, really, really hard. It was okay in some of the older buildings downtown in New York. So in the financial districts, those buildings were built differently than modern office buildings. But it's really hard to see residential conversions. A lot of the buildings, if they're going to become residential, are going to have to be knocked down.
Yeah, and then at that point, it's not much of a conversion. You're like knocking it down. You're like, hey, let's build an apartment building.
Yeah.
I have been in the downtown office buildings that have been converted, and some of them are very nice, but they're still also funky. Like all the dimensions are funky.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's you can see people sometimes like funky, like it's like lofts or whatever. They have a little bit of that feel to them. It's like a unique space, but it's not going to be a massive source of housing, particularly because the state and city are going to require, if they ever do allow this, are going to require a good amount of the apartments that are created to be deed restricted affordable. Or rent restricted, and the result will be that the economics of it doesn't work out, even if you can overcome some of the building code changes. And so I don't think there's any realistic opportunities for residential conversions, particularly in New York, in the short or medium term, unless the politics changes pretty substantially.
Yeah, and you mentioned San Francisco, which has these problems revved up even higher, perhaps. I mean, there are very large office buildings. You're saying that their occupancy is lower than 50%, which wouldn't surprise me.
No, it's much lower. Yeah, San Francisco is the lowest of any downtown in the country.
So is that like 20, 25?
Yeah, something like that. I don't have the number in my hand, but it's really low.
And what's interesting is both New York and San Francisco, these buildings were premium priced before. I mean, they could command crazy rents, and then now they can't rent it for any level.
I mean, it's unclear whether they can rent it for any level. So there's been the price discovery has been slow in this area, and there's some reasons you might imagine. Something about their contracts, the things that there's been some lack of desire to take losses, which may affect the banks, and there's a couple of things going on. But it has been whether they're permanently useless or temporarily useless, or just in some kind of stasis due to some kind of difficulty working out contracts is a little hard to say.
You're right, is in that we don't know what the correct price level is And there are a lot of incentives in place for them not to rent something for a song, because then everyone else in the building is like, wait, what? They're getting it for a song. And then your creditors are like, wait, what? You're renting it for that level. If you rent it at that level, you can never pay us back. And so there are a lot of folks who are probably frozen in place.
Yeah, the problem is in some ways pretty similar to the problem we've seen in New York for a while about retail vacancies, which is like retail space is really expensive in New York. Why was it the case that there were so many retail vacancies even before COVID? And the answer was like there were a lot of difficulties with contracts and pricing in the way that you describe, and so we might need legal interventions of other sorts to encourage the market to shake out a little better.
Yeah, the average retail lease is probably something like 4 or 5 years, and a lot of folks aren't able to make that kind of commitment.
This will have some effect on commercial property tax revenue going forward, which will be a big problem. And places like New York are obviously very dependent on commercial property taxes, but so are almost all downtowns. And you're seeing, differential problems across jurisdictions. Office uptake in southern jurisdictions is much higher than it is in New York and San Francisco, but it's a problem everywhere that you're seeing decline in commercial property values, and that is particularly a fiscal problem because they're generally taxed at higher rates.
This podcast is sponsored by ExpressVPN. In a tough economy, you're looking for ways to save money, and you know a sneaky way you can do it? ExpressVPN. Now, you're asking yourself, how is that possible? Doesn't ExpressVPN cost money? It does cost less than $7 a month, but it can help you unlock content that will save you money for days and days. What do I mean? For example, let's say I'm a Duran Duran fan, which I am. I want to watch the concert movie of Duran Duran, but it is not available on Netflix in the US. However, with ExpressVPN, I can just beam myself into the UK, click on Netflix, and voila. Duran Duran and a bunch of other content I could not have gotten any other way. It's a no-brainer. If you want to preserve your own data from the big tech companies and get more content and save money while you're at it, go to expressvpn.com/yang. Don't forget to use my link so you can get 3 extra months free. That's expressvpn.com/yang. expressvpn.com/yang to learn more. So you can see problems developing. And your book goes through city and state failures, I suppose. I was going to say bankruptcies or financial struggles, though a lot of them didn't hit bankruptcy, which you also go into. So you describe it as a trilemma. By the way, is that a real word, or did you coin that?
No. Trilemma is a word that, whether it's a real word is an interesting question. It was famously coined, I say it's famous like this is Taylor Swift or something, by 2 economists, Mundell and Fleming, to refer to trade-offs in the context of exchange rates, and Danny Roderick has revived it to think about international democracy and financial flows, and so it's been used in other places. But the basic idea I offer is that if the federal government sees a state or city in fiscal distress, it has 3 things it would...
Yeah, let's take a real example. So let's say Detroit, which I spent about a lot of time in, is running out of money circa 2013 because of a bunch of pension liabilities and other things. I mean, their tax base, got decimated, et cetera, et cetera. So then what the heck do we do? Continue.
Right. So the federal government has basically 3 choices. It can offer a bailout, and offering a bailout would help both Detroit's ability to borrow going forward and help avoid austerity right now, which would be bad for the economy because these things are generally happen during recessions, but would create what we call moral hazard, which is that both Detroit's government and other governments might grow to, and really importantly, lenders to those governments might expect the federal government to come to their aid every time there's a problem. You could force austerity, force them to sell absolutely everything, cut services to the bone, and doing that would avoid moral hazard and would encourage future lending, but would come at the cost of social services to people right now and also real economic harm because you'd be firing people during a recession. And then finally, the other thing is you could encourage default or bankruptcy, and doing that would avoid moral hazard from lending and would avoid the worst of austerity, but would discourage future investment. And why is discouraging future investment bad? Well, we rely on states and cities to build all infrastructure. Federal government is a player in infrastructure, but it's a minor player, particularly when you take into consideration maintenance and operations costs. And defaults are difficult for that because who wants to lend money if they're going to lose money? And so the federal government faces this real trade-off. Well, what are you going to do about a problem like Detroit? And over the course of American history, we've done different things. So in the case of Detroit, there was both kind of a mix of austerity and default through the bankruptcy process. But in probably the most famous of all of these instances, Alexander Hamilton's plan to assume state debts. Well, that's just a pure bailout, right? So states had a lot of debts. They were having trouble paying. The federal government just took their debts. And so that was a pure bailout. And it had the effect of creating moral hazard. That is to say, British and Dutch lenders going forward thought that the federal government would always cover state debts. In fact, they thought it after, so a bunch of states default in the 1840s and then another bunch default in the 1870s, but the British still thought that this was something the federal government would cover. So when the British owed money to the federal U.S. government after World War I, they tried to have those debts offset by money Arkansas had defaulted, which is kind of a funny little story. So in some situations we've done bailouts, some situations we've done defaults, as I mentioned, and a lot of situations we've done austerity, and we've kind of varied these policies over time because they're all bad. There's no one silver bullet answer to what to do about a problem like Detroit, or what to do about a problem like New York City in the 1970s, or what to do about a problem like Arkansas, who defaults in the 1840s, 1870s, and 1930s. It's just a series of difficult choices, and you need to figure out how to make the choices less bad and how to avoid the problem going forward. So I say in the book that one of the central principles about dealing with state and local debt crisis is what I call the War Games principle, after the movie War Games. The movie War Games ends with a computer realizing that thermonuclear, it's a funny game. The only way to win is not to play. And the best thing the federal government can do with respect to states and cities is come up with ways to state and city fiscal problems, is to encourage them to be responsible through incentives, and we can talk about how they might do so, and also to come up with ways to minimize the harms of those defaults.
Yeah, so another real life example. I like to keep it concrete for people because this stuff's going to get real in a hurry. So another one's Puerto Rico, which I've spent a lot of time in, and Puerto Rico is not a state, so it doesn't have some protections that states have had, and so it did not get bailed out. They essentially got pushed into bankruptcy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Congress created, it was initially, its states and cities were found that they were ineligible for bankruptcy, so Congress had, by the Supreme Court, so Congress had to create a whole new bankruptcy law, effectively. They didn't call it bankruptcy, but it was the same rules as we apply to things like Detroit for Puerto Rico, and this had real effects, right? So lots of people lent money to Detroit. Some of them did so well after it was clear that Detroit was, that Puerto Rico was not going to be able to pay. There was some real financial.
There was financial alchemy. Is you know what? I'm going to lend these guys money, and then I'm going to get it back.
Right, yeah. I think my favorite of it is that in Detroit, one of their last big borrowings, they were well beyond their legal limits for what they could borrow, and so they came up with this jury-rigged scheme that used some of the same legal tools that Enron used, kind of as Enron declined, and there's special purpose vehicles and all of this weirdo stuff, and it was pretty obviously not good. But the big municipal bond publication, the Bond Buyer, gave it Midwest Deal of the Year. After they did all this, the mayor who had been the mayor of Detroit went to jail, but not for that. So it's one of those things.
Yeah, so there are, and I remember in Puerto Rico, there were just people taking bets essentially, and saying well, I think this debt's going to get repriced at this, I'll buy it at this, and then they exerted political pressure to try and get their money back.
And again, that's been happening forever. So in Hamilton's plan to assume state debts, one of the arguments against it was that the then equivalent of what we can now call vulture funds had bought up a lot of the debt, and then when the debt gets paid at 100 cents on the dollar, they bought the debt well below that. And the same thing happened in Puerto Rico. So again, these are long American stories, but it certainly happened in Puerto Rico. And so Puerto Rico got a bankruptcy rule, and several interesting things happened. So I'm a big fan of legal bankruptcy processes for jurisdictions, but they it raises some really difficult questions about, like, how much can you expect a government to cut before you allow it to default? And similarly, how do you treat different classes of debtors? Do you treat pensioners and bondholders the same way? And so these are really contested issues, and one of the things I like about a legal process is it puts some constraint on kind of the sheer realpolitik of the pensioners and bondholders fighting for political attention. That there's at least someone who is at least somewhat removed from the situation, ensuring that the treatment is not too unfair.
So you open your book with a hypothetical about Chicago and Illinois becoming insolvent, and then the hashtags, which I guess you made up, is like Chicago Way was one. Illinois is over, I think was the other.
Yeah, a little corny maybe, but it's yes. The idea is,
man, they seem great.
There you go.
Nice
there you go. It's you're the social media expert. No, it's the idea to force you to think about what it is you would do if you were either a voter in this situation, politicians were doing something, or if you were a politician facing these questions. And there are really difficult choices, right? So if you bail them out, I say a senator from Texas says you absolutely can't bail them out. That would create belief in both Chicago and other jurisdictions that they're going to get money forever, and everyone will, at the bond market, will lend money to these governments, for any government, no matter what form it takes, forever, because they know they'll get bailed out. On the other hand, like you could imagine being like, well, cutting all the jobs there or raising taxes will lead to people leaving the jurisdiction, and that's bad, and it will cause a decline in Chicago, one of our great important cities. Crime will go up, social services will go down, that's bad. And then if they default, well, like, who's going to lend money to jurisdictions if a big rich place like Chicago or Illinois can't meet its obligations? And so these are really difficult choices. And so I have some ideas about things we could do to make the problem better, but it's worth thinking about what you would do, because one of the things I found during the COVID period is there was a lot of intense arguing about what the federal government, should we have a state bankruptcy law? Should we offer all of this aid? Is it a blue state bailout? Is it a red state bailout? And I found that the people talking about this really didn't take the time to realize how hard a set of choices were facing the government. It was just a lot of yelling.
Hey YouTube, glad you're enjoying the podcast. If you really like it, hit subscribe, and then YouTube will notify you every time we have a bang up new guest. Thank you. So what's fascinating is I remember pre-COVID in the run-up, you look at cities like New York and Chicago, and it felt like they were on top of the world. And then it seems like things have very, very quickly turned around in a particular way. I will say, like, it's pretty clear that these downtowns and commercial office buildings are going to take many years to recover, if they do recover. That if you just expect everyone to come back, because office culture has changed. Like, you ask workers what they want to do, and uniformly they're like, hey, I love work from home. Maybe I'll hybrid it up and like come in if you force me to, that sort of thing. And employers right now are beholden to their people, and you can judge that in a particular way. I certainly know that if you were a representative of the city, you'd be rooting for everyone to come back in full force. But it's also true that a lot of even city employees, are like, what am I doing in this freaking office building? So you're seeing in many ways the value prop of the city get changed and called into question. There have been winners and losers to this. Certainly some of the winners have been these Sunbelt areas where they have lower tax rates and people can just decamp to in various ways. So you're going to see many cities struggle, and the danger is that there is like a negative spiral that develops. It's like, well, okay, my tax revenues go down, so I'm going to cut services, and then people are like, wait, what am I doing here if the trash isn't getting picked up or whatnot?
Two things. I think that's all really, really smart. Places like New York because demand is so high to live there, even with a relative decline. New York could still attract people, right? If they allowed more housing to be built, housing in New York is still very expensive, and so if they allowed more housing to be built, there would still be people who want to live in New York. It's not so clear that's true for some other downtowns, but for New York, and for New York, you're seeing like there's still. I mean, look at the price of apartments. They've decreased. They've not increased as much as outlying areas, but the prices are still really high, and that suggests there's still demand to live in New York. But it's certainly less. I mean, what people call the donut effect around cities has become true, which is that the outlying areas have gotten more expensive relative to the inlying areas, and this is because people want home offices. There's increased demand for housing. People don't want roommates as much, and people can work from home, and so it's both having interregional effects and then in-regional effects, but like the areas in Connecticut and even further are doing very well. And so that's one story. Another story is that in some ways we should expect this to create a little more interlocal inequality. So one of the things that was constraining people from just rich people to just moving near other rich people is into small town is that they had to commute. You still had to go to the office. And to the extent you can just go to Vail or go to wherever, that is Palm Beach, right? That we might expect to see greater interlocal inequality. The last thing I'll say about this, that I think that you're kind of pointing towards with the end of your comments, is this one, is that it puts a lot more pressure on cities to do better. If people have more residential choice, even if they have they're hybrids, so they have greater ability to commute further, it makes cities have to compete along a different dimension, which is they have to make it nice to live there. And so New York is great to live in. I love living in New York. But on the other hand, there's garbage on the streets everywhere. And in a more competitive atmosphere, you're going to have to solve some of those problems. You see the kind of cost of this, the kind of heavy street disorder in San Francisco, I think, or LA, being like a really dramatic instance of the kind of thing that greater exit pressure will punish. And so hopefully we can get people to focus on cities in their kind of, to make them more competitive as places to live and places to enjoy and not just places to commute to.
So you wrote a piece that was published in The Atlantic recently that I enjoyed immensely, and it ends by saying, hey, we don't really pay that much attention to what's going on in local government, so maybe we should, because it's going to become more important.
Yeah, I mean, so the evidence on this is really, really, really dramatic and really interesting. So over the last, increasing over the last 50 years, but particularly in the last 10 and 20 years, voters have paid less and less attention to particularly legislative elections at the state and local level. So the evidence of this is that the level of split ticket voting, or the degree to which people vote for the kind of correlation between people's presidential voting and state legislative voting, has now reached almost it's like in the high 90s of percentage, that almost no one votes for a different party.
It's all tribal now. It's not like, hey, I like this person, I like that person. So yeah,
right.
I like this team.
And and everyone also thinks that it's driven by the national. So it's not like people are like, I dislike my state legislature and therefore I'm going to punish President Biden. It's going the other way around. And this is a really, really, really negative effect, because it's not clear that anything that happens in the state legislature actually matters to who wins elections, right? So it's this people in the state legislature could do whatever, and it's just not clear that it has much effect on who wins elections. And so what does matter in those bodies is what the beliefs of either the extremely unrepresentative primary voters and or interest groups who are kind of influence politics in other ways. And so that has a couple of really negative effects. One is that obviously the policies are less representative, but a second thing is that it results in almost certainly results in more spending. And less taxing, let's say, like less fiscal responsibility, because the people who are participating in these elections are what political scientists call intense policy demanders. Well, why would you pay attention? Because you want something, or you want to stop something. And the result of that is that elections are these state elections and local elections are pretty unrepresentative and result in less than attractive outcomes. And then you can see this across policy areas. So what is NIMBYism in housing? Well, one of the reasons we see it is that the people who show up in city council primaries are a deeply unrepresentative swath of voters who are mostly homeowners or people with like strong local interests, and they don't represent the broader public and the broader public's interest in growth. And similarly, the groups who ask for things and participate and do endorsements in these areas can be everything from groups wanting money, public employee unions, all sorts of people who it's perfectly fine for them to want to be involved in politics, but the absence of mass politics at the local, state, and local level, that is to say, or giving tools to ordinary people to voice their preferences through competitive elections, is a tragedy both for our budgets and for policy.
Yeah, you have a quote from the book that I enjoyed. It said, that is, state and local officials do not seek and do not receive a public mandate from ordinary voters. What? They are instead responsive to narrow and unrepresentative groups of voters and interests. And that's what you just described.
Yeah, I mean, look, you live this, and so I don't need to tell you, but we can talk to the audience. It's that what it is when you start thinking about how one gets elected to county commissioner or state legislator, it just doesn't have very much to do with doing a good job in office and getting rewarded for it. And one of the ironies, of course, is that national politics, works much more like that. And so it is the case that we, as voters, generally know what Republicans and Democrats are all about. And it's like, which party is pro-abortion and which party is anti-abortion. It's pretty easy to do. And so you can punish bad economic results. And there's there's evidence of that, although that has actually been waning a little bit, but it's still a real effect. And we see this for incumbent New York City mayors. So when you have executive officers, it's a little easier for voters to kind of turn them into brands themselves. And so there's evidence that when crime rates go up, mayoral popularity goes down in New York City. But when crime rates go up, people don't punish their city council members, but city council members have a lot of influence on these policies. And so when transportation doesn't work, people don't punish their state legislators, even though state legislators are the ones deciding how to fund the MTA or about policies about the MTA. And political reform at the state and local level is really, really, really important. It's important for these budgetary concerns because, again, the lack of mass control results systematically in less responsible budgeting. But it's a big problem for lots of other policy areas as well. It's just we're in a deeply unhealthy time for state and local democracy, and this is driven by a couple of forces. One is the decline of local media.
Yeah.
And there's some really amazing findings on this. So when a local paper closes, the borrowing cost for the jurisdictions that it covers goes up. Because
they literally get worse interest rates because they're like, I don't really care.
Yeah, right. Because if you're lending to government, you're like, oh God, these officials are going to be super corrupt. No one's paying attention. Why am I going to lend them money? And you see split ticket voting falls. And so that's a real problem. But a lot of the problem is in voters themselves. That is to say, why isn't there more local media? Well, some of it is technological, but some of it is that we're addicted to the entertainment value of politics, and national politics can be a little more entertaining. And so it's incumbent upon people with a megaphone to remind people that these local things have a big effect on their lives.
Three-quarters of Americans wish they started investing earlier, and over 2/3 of Gen Zers feel the same way. You know why it's tough? It's because it's tricky. It's daunting. It's intimidating. You know who has started an app to solve that? Are the founders of Bloom. Bloom app is the award-winning financial services app. It's made by young people for young people. I've met the founders. They are great guys who want to make you or the people in your life who are young and just starting out financially literate. Check it out at bloomapp.com, and there's a special offer for listeners to this podcast, $15 in free stock and 1 month subscription for free. Go to bloomapp.com/yang to sign up today, bloomapp.com/yang. Why stay in the dark in terms of financial literacy? Let's get educated, people. bloomapp.com/yang. Yeah, the death of whatever it is now, 3,000 newspapers, that really hurts, because how the heck are you going to pay attention to what's going on locally if no one's covering it?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's interesting. I was talking to these people about this idea they had to use AI to build local papers out, and like, I don't know whether it's a good idea or a bad idea, but it's at least responsive to like a real need to like tell people
To
what's
the void,
happening.
the vacuum,
Yeah,
because there's a
the
real void, the
vacuum,
vacuum.
right?
I'll
Like,
tell you a story about a local city councilman who attended meetings, and there was a reporter there, and everyone had their back straight and were buttoned up, and then the reporter just stopped coming, probably because they lost their job. And then everyone started. I mean, shouldn't laugh. I mean, it's terrible. But then everyone just started acting completely differently because it's like, well, like the observer's not in the room, and they can just let them
oh
all
no,
hang out.
it is really one of the worst things that's happened to American democracy.
I'm a big fan of something in Congress called the Local Journalism Sustainability Act that would shore up the ability for local papers to exist and compete. Last I checked, it had 6 sponsors, which means it's a couple hundred away. But that thing just confuses the heck out of me because like red and blue, it's like you don't want a local paper. You have the sense almost that there are folks who's like, I kind of prefer operating in a journalism free zone.
Yeah, I mean, you certainly see that, but you understand why politicians might want that, right? So a politician might want to be in a journalism-free zone because then no one's watching them, and so once they achieve a Combet effect, then they'll be fine. They can, do ads and whatever. In New York, we have some green shoots on this front. So, I mean, I'm a big fan of The City, the newspaper, which is a nonprofit.
We have some. It's like a massive market, so you have some very admirable local journalism efforts.
Yeah, and so in Connecticut, where I work, there's a really wonderful nonprofit called the CT Mirror that does probably the best budget reporting of any state paper in the country. I mean, it's not even a paper; it's an online product. But again, the audiences for these things are pretty small. People, the old trick of media was that people would pick it up for the sports and for the classified ads, and then get the politics by kind of osmosis from it. And now, like even when people do get papers, like they're getting the New York Times, the New York Times has cut its local coverage really dramatically. And so they're not getting that. They may be focusing on Ukraine, they may be focusing on Wordle,
Yeah.
but
They
they're
don't
not
have
focused.
much Metro reporting, the Metro desk, like the number of journalists assigned to that.
Yeah, no,
keeps
it
going
is
down.
it is wild to me how little. I mean, it's just it's how little. Given, I mean, the Times particularly is such a financially successful product and such a successful product that like they don't feel a little bit more noblesse oblige to cover New York more. Is pretty shocking.
Well, so I just wanted to hit this a little bit more. So the for-profit model of journalism was invented, when people figured out, it's like, hey, I can print these things, I can put ads on it, da-da-da. And it lasted until Craigslist, so it lasted a long time. I think that this should be seen as a public good and have more public funding, public-private partnerships, treated as a nonprofit. There are a lot of markets that could sustain a break-even paper that was well run. It just can't get stock market type returns. And what's happened was that the remaining local papers got gobbled up by various financial players, private equity funds and hedge funds, and then just got stripped down. And then you just, again, don't have any local reporting.
I mean, we have a lot of unbelievably rich people in America, and being a newspaper magnate, even if it was a non-profitable newspaper magnate, is a great way to achieve like social renown and influence. And so it's always been curious to me that you don't see more of this, that like people are happy to give hundreds of millions of dollars to put their name on Lincoln Center or put their name on a public building or upon university. But like in terms of affecting both like for good and also for ego, like running a newspaper seems to me to be like one of the best things you could do.
Well, I mean, you have seen various billionaires pick up publications, but they're more national, to your point.
Yeah,
right?
they do
Bezos
national.
buying the Washington Post, Benioff buying Time, things like that.
On the other hand, I think that there are other things we could imagine doing in addition to helping local media, which again I support as well. In terms of kind of making some legal changes to encourage kind of local party formation. So one thing I've always liked is the idea of, first of all, 2 things. One is giving mayors and governors more power relative to legislators, because we have some idea who they are, whereas we don't know who the local legislator is, so we don't know who's on the city council. A lot of the worries we have are, since like the mayor's out of control, they can be checked by other layers of government. And so stronger mayors seem to me to be a really attractive solution. Another thing might be to kind of try to create what I call local party brands in some work, where the mayor has either the power or maybe even the responsibility to endorse candidates for city council on the ballot. So you can vote for, so if you're in New York, you could vote for the Adams slate or the anti-Adams slate next time you vote for city council, and that would be a way of bringing democracy into these elections. You could even imagine doing that at the primary level as well.
I like it. It's the case that 75% of the country now is governed by one party or the other. Where you imagine it's a two-party system. It's not really for most people. Where you have Democrats running things, all branches of government here in New York, and then you go to a place like Missouri to just be the reverse. And it's one reason why I agree with you about this local party formations, that if you can get more of that, because the minority party in a lot of these places is something of a non-factor.
Yeah, it's actually a really interesting thing. Like, one question you might ask is, like, why doesn't the local party, the local minority party, rebrand itself to be different from the national party to become more competitive? So there's like, why is it that the Republicans in New York and the Democrats in Missouri are just like kind of consent to failure by adopting unpopular positions? So like, you're not going to win elections in Missouri if you are broadly pro-choice. It's just not where the voters are, and so the opposite's true in New York. And there are two real problems with this. One is that even where they do rebrand themselves on policy, it's not clear that voters care. So the Massachusetts Republican Party, the surveys seem to be pretty close to the median voter. Certainly Governor Baker, who had been a Republican in Massachusetts, was a very popular governor. And it's not clear voters paid any attention one way or the other. Democrats have controlled the Massachusetts legislature for more than 100 years. But secondly, those parties are governed through internal democracy that makes them pretty unresponsive to the voters. So who's choosing their candidates? Well, it's primary voters who are themselves definitionally in the local minority, and so that's a pretty unhealthy. You can see break from this with executives. So Baker, or your New York example, your Bloomberg's and Giuliani's, or Giuliani before.
So I'm part of an effort trying to do what you just described in California. It's called the Common Sense Party of California, and it's meant to be a counterweight and a choice to the Democrats because it's just bad not to have any competition.
I mean, the good thing about doing it in California is that you have the top two primary system.
Yeah.
So they've electorally made it possible to do so. Now, it's obviously going to be a huge challenge, right? So voters still associate the Democrats, very positively associated with the Democrats. So what you really want to be is like alt Democrats or moderate Democrat or whatever it is.
I will say that there's some frustration with the Dems in California.
For sure. I mean, California is going to have some huge budget problems going forward also, but it's definitely the case that they still win all the elections, right? So there's some frustration, but...
it's an uphill climb. I mean, I'll actually give you the numbers, so it'll be fun. So we need 73,000 people to sign up to get party recognition in California, and we're at 32,000 now. So any Californians listening to this, check out cacommonsense.org. But that is one of the paths you described.
Yeah, you can just run. I mean, this is the thing, is they can be Democrats even. So we see, one of the things you see in New York is this idea called fusion, where two parties endorse the same candidate. And in New York, it actually doesn't work very well. It doesn't really mean anything. People don't get a lot of information from knowing that someone's endorsed by the
Working Families Party.
Or with Working Families. It doesn't actually provide too much information. There used to be one called the Marijuana Green Party, which is now, again, at the time was a fringe party and now is a super majoritarian party. I don't even know. The real question is how to create a differentiated brand in voters' mind that people will understand that they're part of the national Democrats for New York, or in Missouri, the opposite. I'm not being specific. But at the same time, you're providing them with information. This is part of a different group, a faction inside the parties.
This podcast is sponsored by Helix Sleep. What the heck is Helix Sleep? It is the mattress of the future company. I have always been someone who valued my sleep. Figured, you're going to do it for 7, maybe even 8 hours. You wake up feeling refreshed and energized. What is that worth? Helix Sleep can help make that happen. Just take their sleep quiz and figure out what personalized mattress should be shipped straight to your door, and you have 100 days to return it. I don't recommend returning it after 99 days, but hey, who am I to say? Don't take my word for it. It's the #1 rated mattress from GQ and Wired. Can you imagine being the mattress tester? It's a job. Someone has it. Helix is offering 20% off all mattress orders and 2 free pillows for our listeners right now. Go to helixsleep.com/yang. This is their best offer yet, and it won't last long. With Helix, better sleep starts now. I mean, what we're doing with Forward is an attempt to introduce competition, and along the way, the lines you describe, which is fascinating. So you referenced it earlier, but I just want to flesh it out a tiny bit. So that you detail in your book that there are incentives for a lot of these local legislators to overspend. You know, they're not exactly great at tightening the belt.
Yeah, I mean, so this is a normal thing about politicians. They end up preying on our weakness as voters, right? So if you're a politician who wants to bear costs, if you think that you can spend money right now, get popular, cut taxes right now, get popular.
Here's the one that really has hurt us, David, but it's, you understand it. Pension obligations. It's like, who really wants to stand on the other side of it and be like, you know what, I'm going to cut all your pensions, even though you've been doing this work for 30 years and you're a sympathetic group.
Yeah, no, I mean, so this is the thing, and this is part of negotiations. Public workers have accepted a lack of raises in the short run, which the governments need to, in return for these long-run obligations. And the reason that politicians like giving pensions relative to giving raises is that, again, they're kicking the can down the road. And we, as a legal matter, so states have what are called we often call state fiscal constitutions, balanced budget rules, and limits on debt issuance. But we don't treat pension obligations as debt for the purposes of those state constitutional obligations. But pension obligations are just debt, right? So you have to pay them. There's a constitutional requirement to pay them. But we treat them as preference for the purpose of our legal regime, even if they're just debt. And this is really, really a huge problem. So in the post-2008 period, jurisdictions had this huge, state and local government had this huge, huge fiscal problems. And they hid them, a lot of them, in underfunding their pensions. And what did this mean? Well, a lot of the state's borrowing capacity, that's the willingness people had to lend them money, was given away to the underfunded pensions. And the period after 2008, when interest rates were low and unemployment was high, should have been this period for this grand infrastructural innovation. Like, that's when you build infrastructures, when interest rates are low and when there are available workers. And look back on that period. Look at your city and say, where is my grand infrastructure? In New York City, we got 3 subway stops along the 2nd Avenue subway. That's what we got. We didn't get, other places in the world got these amazing innovations, and we just didn't get it because jurisdictions weren't budgeting responsibly, and then were hiding their irresponsibility in pension obligations.
I can't imagine elected officials doing such a thing, David. I'm kidding. So you painted a really compelling picture, and the book ends trying to summarize, look, when the shit hits the fan and some of these places are going to run into problems, and you and I have walked through some of the reasons why some of these places are going to run into problems. You have kicking obligations down the road. You have over-relying on federal aid. That's a one-time thing. You might have your commercial tax base erode. Some people might be voting with their feet in various ways. So then shit starts getting dark. And then you have to make the big choice among the 3 options. And you lay out some of the principles for what one should do. So the 3 choices to review, good fun, is bailout, austerity, or default. And I'm going to just give you my personal outlook on this. Is that I remember when things were going bad, and I spent time in Detroit when they were declaring bankruptcy. They were doing some things where you're like, wow, it's rough. Like they have an art collection. And they had to sell it to try and meet their obligations. And at the last minute, one of the local philanthropists came in and bought it because they were about to have their art museum looted. I mean, it's pretty, and you could look at it and be like, well, art not so bad, but there are other things. When you're in a rough time, it seems like firing more people is not the best move. You don't want to add fuel to a bad fire, so to speak. I totally understand the moral hazard issue because it's like everyone's just like, hey, let's just spend, and then anytime we get into trouble, it's like the bailout comes. And so it feels like the managed process of like a quasi bankruptcy default is like a middle of the road move. The problem then is that lenders get sad and say, you know what, I'm not going to give you guys as much as much money. Now, I like that. That strikes me as the least problematic, just in the sense that, like, there are a lot of problems why we have a hard time building, and I'm sure financing is one issue, but it doesn't strike me as the main issue. It seems like the main issue is around like the overregulation, the layers, the complexity, the capture, the corruption, probably, like that's attendant. So anyway, those are my 2 cents on the big three of bailout, austerity, and default.
So, I mean, I think my preferences take 2 forms on this. I mean, so again, in the book, I think the situation will depend. So it'll depend a little bit which one you prefer. Totally. And so I don't give a single one answer to rule them all type of answer. But I think that what you can do is adopt balanced solutions, and then you can add conditions to some of your support that help avoid problems going forward. And so what do I mean by balanced solutions? So things like bankruptcy, but also things like giving federal aid to both states and cities at the same time, can result in a little default, a little austerity, and a little moral hazard. And that has the fact that they're small amounts rather than large amounts, there's kind of declining marginal harms. And so in the Detroit instance, as you know, the philanthropist came through, was called the Grand Bargain. After bankruptcy, they came through with a bunch of money to support the art museum. But the state, which had been kind of holding out and not been super friendly to Detroit, also gave a lot of money in matching the philanthropist money. But they did it after bankruptcy had been declared, and the result was that it didn't create too much moral hazard, because who would want to go through bankruptcy just to get federal aid? That's crazy. Or state aid. That's crazy. On the other hand, it mitigated the harms of the bankruptcies. The pensioners just didn't do that badly between the philanthropist aid and the state aid. They would have done even better if the federal government had offered a little bit too, as President Obama wanted to do. And so this kind of balanced approach is attractive. The other thing I think is really attractive is that the federal government is going to give money. And realistically, it has given, in the last 2 big crises, particularly during COVID, it gave an enormous amount of money. It should attach some conditions to that money in order to encourage states to do a little better. And so what do I mean? If the federal money had said, you can get this federal money, or you can get other streams of federal money. The federal government's giving states and cities money all the time. In return, though, you have to budget in accordance with GAAP, with generally accepted accounting principles, or you have to accept what Connecticut put into its bond, a covenant into its bonds, which are a volatility cap. They put a couple covenants, but one was which is that if you're getting a one-time amount of money, you have to save a certain percentage of it. And the conditionality can help you avoid the problems going forward. So take advantage of the fact that you're doing something you'd rather not do, which is this aid, in return to get some conditionality. And so that has 2 nice effects. One is that the conditions hopefully are good themselves, but secondly, the conditions are painful. And so it makes taking aid less pleasant than it might otherwise be. It's not a free lunch. And so one of the things, so the federal aid during COVID to states and cities was almost certainly too large. It was, it certainly has helped to kick off inflation.
They took a fire hose out. They just went, and I got it. Now, you were saying, hey, at least it could have been a conditional fire hose.
It could have been conditional, and it probably should have been, like less of a fire hose and more of a super soaker. Whatever. But one of the interesting things is that one of the reasons it was so big was because they were trying to avoid the moral hazard problems. Because they give it to every place. But not every place had a fiscal problem, but they just gave money to everybody. And that helps reduce moral hazard because you're not rewarding a jurisdiction for
behavior. You're just
right.
Like, you exist, here you go.
But you are just splashing out the cash. And of course, the jurisdictions that are in fiscal control care about it more, so it still creates some moral hazard. Anyway, they could have done more with this, and they had time to do it, not in CARES, but in ARP. They really did have a chance to think this through a little bit better, as far as I'm concerned. So those are the principles, which is, I think they should attempt, the federal government, when it's facing one of these crises, you're going to make a bad choice. It's going to be a choice that's painful, but you can build things into it to make it a balanced bad choice, that is to say, just a little bad across a number of dimensions, and you can use it to create situations such that we are we're less likely to see these problems going forward. And the last thing I'll say is that we could probably build the federal system to be a little more resilient against crises. So two ways we could make it a little more resilient, and one is we could encourage places to make it a little easier to move in and out, and so that would have the effect. So right now, when a jurisdiction faces a fiscal crisis, all the rich people leave, but all the poor people can't leave because housing costs in other places are too high. And so to make it a little easier to move around the country, and I have some ideas about how to do that. But a second thing is to, sometimes this codes as a left-wing idea and sometimes it codes as a right-wing idea, but we could remove from states some responsibility for some of our cooperative federal programs in return for giving them full control over some other things. And so the big one is, like, one of the big problems of state cuts or state and local cuts during fiscal crises or during recessions is Medicaid. The states and government co-fund Medicaid, and states have to cut because they have to keep a balanced budget during downturns. But that's just when everyone wants Medicaid, right? So Medicaid is in demand when the economy is bad, and the federal government can bear that cost across the business cycle, but it's a lot harder for a state or city.
Well, we know the next crisis will come, and when it does come, I hope that people mind your book, In a Bad State, Responding to State and Local Budget Crises. You know what the big takeaway here, David, is? Get involved in local politics, pay attention, because those things matter, and some more competition would benefit us all.
I'm 100% with you there. Thank you so much for having me. This was really fun.
Thank you, David. It was a blast, and keep being smart.